Thank you for staying with us. World leaders, heads of financial institutions, gentlemen of the press, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders are in Washington, D.C. in the United States for the 20th International Anti-Corruption Conference, the world's largest independent global forum to fight corruption. This is in commemoration of the International Anti-Corruption Day. This year's conference will focus on the theme uprooting corruption, defending democratic values, and comes at a time in which corruption poses as one of the most serious threats to achieving global development. In Africa, corruption has been highlighted as the bane of the continent's development and the clog in the wheel of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. In Nigeria, money stolen by former government officials are still being uncovered and repatriated into the country. Now, to aid the recovery of stolen funds, this administration initiated the whistleblower policy that has aided it in the recovery of huge sums of stolen funds. Joining us now via Zoom from Washington, D.C. is former Director, Africa Network for Environment and Economic Justice, David Ugolor. Good morning. Thank you for joining us on TVC Breakfast.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Washington.
Right. It's interesting to see that the world is looking at a united front in fighting corruption across the world. Talk to us the sense you're getting with regards to the conversations that have been going on at the International Anti-Corruption Conference with regards to achieving this united front to really fight corruption.
Again, thank you very much, and it's very cold here. And
right. We can see.
Also rainy, and we have thousands of anti-corruption activists, government officials, journalists from around the world convened here discussing different issues and trying to look for solutions to different types of corruptions, and especially with reference to the urgency that the world needs to unite around strategy and approaches that will deal with the issue of corruption, and particularly against the background of increasing poverty around the world. The war going on in Ukraine has also created a big problem for the world, and then the energy crisis, and also the need for looking for solutions on how to address some of the climate change challenges that is currently affecting the international community. So there is optimism. There's a lot of interest from different stakeholders. Civil society are raising questions, and then the recent Glencoe bribery corruption that have affected almost 8 countries, most of them in Africa, Nigeria inclusive. We are also seeing that representative of Glencoe is also in some of the meetings organized by the OECD country, looking into the issue of oil trading, commodity corruption crisis, and how to find solutions that will deal with some of those problems. And we also have some government officials here who have also come to also share their experience on how they are tackling the issue of corruptions.
Right, and well, so far at this program, beyond the optimism that you have, spoken about from stakeholders, what have been the takeaways that stands this conference apart?
Well, as you know, we are almost coming out of the COVID crisis. This is the first time in the last 1 or 2 years that anti-corruption activists, government officials are having their opportunity to also meet in person to discuss some of these issues that I earlier mentioned. One of the key highlights that I think I'm taking away from here was the suggestion by Peter Egan, the founder of Transparency International. He talks about the issue of multi-stakeholder approach in dealing with corruption. And as you know, Nigeria is one country where the issue of multi-stakeholder have put in practice. If you recall, our major source of income in Nigeria is from oil. And the recent corruption cases involving Glencoe and some key government officials in NNPC have exposed the flaws in multi-stakeholder approach in tackling corruption in the extractive sector. If you look, for example, Nigeria is one of the first countries that implemented the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. And Nigeria went further to put this into law by turning the AITI to the National Assembly. And we have today the Nigerian Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative Act. And that makes it possible for Nigeria to put in practice the multi-stakeholder approach where different stakeholders are part of the National Stakeholder Working Group. But unfortunately, NAITI hasn't been able to deliver on some of these grand corruption issues, particularly with the reference to the Glencoe bribery scandal, and that have now shown clearly in the fact statement that key government officials in NNPCs are involved in the bribery case. And when Nigeria filing for victim, as a victim at the fine settlement in London, in the London court, and this was thrown out because obviously if you look into the global financial asset recovery principle, you wouldn't expect those who perpetuate corruptions to benefit for asset recovery. So the expectation is that Nigerian government need to take an urgent step to demonstrate to the international community that those government officials that were involved in the Glencoe bribery case that are currently in NNPC need to be exposed, need to be uncovered, to show to the world that the Nigerian government is serious. And as you know, NNPC is one of the companies that signed on to the EITI principle. But unfortunately, what we're seeing, those principles that we sign on to on transparency and accountability, avoiding corruption issues, are not working. And this is not very good for the credibility of the country, particularly as NAITI and NNPC will be subjected to assessment next year. And this information coming out is really, really bad for the country.
Why do you think the measures put in place are not working, like you pointed out? What are we not doing right? What is the missing link? What are the gaps that are stopping us from achieving, painting a better picture of ourselves outside the world?
Well, I raised this with Peter Egan at this conference day before yesterday, and I said very clearly the reason why the multi-stakeholder is not working is the way that we have organized the participation of civil society in the National Stakeholder Working Group. It has been politicized, and unfortunately, when you don't get the civil society to participate in a credible way, you don't expect any result from such a process. Lack of transparency in civil societal engagement in the entire NAITI process is very damaging to the whole process. And that is one weak point of the Nigerian Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. There's lack of transparency. Civil society participation in the process is not very transparent. And one of the biggest coalitions that is engaged in this process have raised a number of concerns around the issues. And that is really, really an issue that needs to be tabled as we are approaching the assessment of NAITI next year. And then another issue that I also looked is that the lack of political will at the leadership level. This is really the real challenge that Nigeria is faced. And if you looked even the IMF report, you also see some of this issue of lack of political will. The lack of political will at the highest level of leadership in the country is also a very big problem. Then resource for the anti-corruption agencies to do their work is also a big problem. If you look the EFCC and ICPC, they're trying to do the best they can, but you know they need to be resourced very well. You need to put in resources to be able to capacitate the institutions to be able to undertake intelligence investigation. And unfortunately, this is a big challenge in the country. So we expect that if the government are genuinely committed in tackling grand corruption in NNPC, those officials that were named in the Glencoe bribery case will be exposed. But if Nigerian government continue to cover them up, there is no way you will say that Nigeria is implementing extractive industry transparency initiative in Nigeria.
But is there really a way, or how are stakeholders like yourself working on curbing this issue of lack of political will, even in the massive grand scale oil theft dimensions here in Nigeria? That's it crops up everywhere. The issue of corruption. Look at the Niger Delta. You are an environmentalist, and I'm sure you're mindful of all those implications. But how do we curb this big elephant in the room? Lack of political will. It's a very, very familiar narrative. But how do we go beyond this point?
Well, I think the first thing is, like I said, is first of all raising awareness. That's exactly what TVC is actually doing now. The starting point of solving your problem is to be aware of the problem, and then you begin to look for strategy to deal with the problem. As you know, this current government is coming to an end by next year. One of the key agenda that brought in this government was the issue of corruption. But unfortunately, in dealing with this problem, there have been a lot of challenges. The government have also succeeded in achieving a lot along in the issue of asset recovery. Most of the resources that were recovered from the Abacha's family has been put into use in the social protection program. And that has been very successful internationally. And that has attracted a lot of positive reporting on this administration, which I will say that the administration have done very well. And then in the issue of implementation of the open governance partnership, commitment, if you look some of the commitments, the government has really not done well. And that has really been a big problem. And some of the audit reports coming from the Auditor General in the country, in terms of implementing the key recommendations from them, has also been a very big challenge. And then the weak opposition that we have in the country is also a major problem. The only time we know about opposition party in Nigeria is when election is approaching. And this is not good for democracy. For you to have a democracy that is efficient, effective, delivering, you need an effective opposition party. But the situation when election is finished, you have the opposition party going to sleep, and it's only when election is approaching, you get their candidates going around asking for vote. So it is really bad. In the United States here, the opposition party, the Republican Party, they play their role. They work closely to make sure they keep their eyes on what government is doing. And then they also profile alternative solutions. But back there in Nigeria, this is not the situation. The only time you know about opposition party, it is when there is election. And once election is over, you see the opposition leaders off to their different country. They are hardly staying in the country. This is really unfortunate. And democracy doesn't work like that. You need an opposition party, you need a viral civil society, you need a good media environment to be able to sustain democratic values that sustains transparency and accountability. And in the absence of these, you have a weak political will within the government in moving forward with some of the corruption issues, particularly against the background that petroleum and oil and gas is a very attractive ecosystem for grand corruption. And Nigeria is a poster child for that. You're seeing now the grand oil theft that is going on in the Niger Delta. Nothing has happened. You look the massive resources that's supposed to be going to Niger Delta people, the oil producing community, the 13% oil derivation. We only heard about it just now. We are heading up to election. Billions of naira that's supposed to be going to poor people living under the oil exploitation across the Niger Delta region. The billions are going to private pocket. You know about the forensic report at the NDDC. The outcome of that forensic report, nothing has happened. These all show clearly lack of political will. And this is not very good for the country. And then the level of poverty is increasing because there is a correlation between poverty and corruption. And you see that recently the report that was shown that over 133 million Nigerians are poor. This is not good for the country. The danger is that there is a direct linkage with crisis, conflict, and violence across the country. because the more you have poor people, the more you have people who are willing to go to the way of crisis, the way of conflict. And you can see the Northeast has been submerged in crisis over the years, and that has really contributed and deepening the poverty level in that particular region. So this is the real problem. When we talk about corruption, it's not an empty, it has a face, and the face of corruption is the widespread poverty you find across the country. And this is not good, and the damage that corruption caused in the country is obvious to everybody. And now you can see the knee-jerk response from the CBN. That not going to solve the problem. Right. The lack of national financial, lack of transparency in the financial system is not going to help the situation. The currency trading in Nigeria is a big business, and that
Mr.
is really
Ugolor,
big problem.
I need to come in now so that we can make judicious use of our time. I'm glad you mentioned the aspect of the NBS report saying that there are over 100 million Nigerians, about 133 million Nigerians facing multidimensional poverty. And that has stirred up reactions in the country with regards to where the Minister Clement Agba came out to say that the state governors aren't doing enough with regards to the monies they get, addressing issues that affect people in the rural areas. The federal government is doing what it can do, but the state government is not doing enough to make it that the kind of projects they come up with are not projects that affect the people directly and not beneficial to the people. That's on the one hand. Then the 13% derivation, you said that a lot of people did not know about that, and we're just hearing about that now. And Governor Nyesom Wike, expressed it. It was the one that opened it up, and then we saw some governors beginning to speak up. My question to you is, what NGOs like yours who have engaged with the federal government, how are you putting such people like these state governors on their toes? Now that you get this information, how are you holding them to account? Because the federal government says it can only do one part. The state government has to do theirs. Are we channeling our energy to even the right persons? Are we questioning the right people?
Thank you very much. It's easy to point fingers. And I think that to solve this problem, it's not about pointing finger. Our president, Buhari, have to take responsibility. He has responsibility, and this is the basis why he was elected as president of Nigeria. As a matter of fact, President Buhari is the anti-corruption champion for the continent. This is the perception, this is the image he has created for himself. So I will not want the president to point finger. Fighting corruption is a huge challenge, no doubt. I don't expect him to solve all the corruption problem in Nigeria. But there are basic things that we expect from President Buhari. And those basic things he hasn't been able to carry it out. One of them is about the issue of 13% oil derivation. Since President Buhari became a president in Nigeria, I'm not sure he has even gone down to the creek, he has gone down to the Niger Delta to see for himself what exactly the 13% has been doing. We have less than 6 months. Buhari will be leaving as Nigerian president, having spent 8 years. And I think he has failed the Niger Delta people. He has failed Nigerians by not being able to actually translate his anti-corruption campaign to reality in the Niger Delta issues. For instance, the 13% oil derivation that we talk about that goes to the governors in the Niger Delta region. It's not just happening. It's not a news, my sister. What the president have said and the presidency have said about billions going to the Niger Delta region is not a news. The forensic report on NDDC on how money we're moving from places to places is not a news. The people that are involved are members of the political party of the president. They are political elite known to the president. We have the anti-corruption agencies in the country that will be able to unpack this problem. Why has it not happened? So that is a problem for the president. To now move to the issue of pointing fingers to the governor, that is not a problem. We have the anti-corruption agency, EFCC. We have ICPC. Those two anti-corruption agencies are not created for just the federal government alone. They also have a responsibility to deal with corruption that is happening across the state. We have the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit, NFIU. Few years ago, they came up with a policy on the issue of transparency on the resources going to the local government across the entire country. What happened to that policy agenda? So that's why I said earlier on when we started this conversation, there is a lack of political will. That is the real challenge in fighting corruption. All we needed and expected when Buhari was elected into presidency was that he was going to be able to have the energy.
That was why I asked, if you will allow me, that was why I asked, what are agencies like yours doing to put government on its toes?
And, you know, these things are not just coming up. Our organization, for example, the African Network for Environment and Economic Justice, we are the one tracking the $325 million that is going to the poorest of the poorest in Nigeria. We've worked closely with top government agencies across the country. I personally was part of the negotiations when the $325.5 million was returned to Nigeria. We also have engaged a number of institutions. I'm part of the Interministerial Committee on Asset Disposal in the country, trying to see how all assets recovered and distributed across the country. We have engaged the federal government. We have also engaged the Nigerian Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. The question is that we as civil society, our role stop at advocacy and then raising the issues and putting them in the public agenda. The government has a responsibility to implement our demands. But unfortunately, this is not happening. For example, when we raise questions around the lack of transparency and accountability in project implementation in NDDC, we put it there in the public. If you Google ANED, Google civil society, it will pop up what we're doing. But the government is not doing anything to take this into concrete implementation. That's the problem. That's where we say there is an impunity. For example, the campaign around transparency to ensure that the resources that is going to NDDC that is supposed to be used for development in the region, we had a forensic audit report. The outcome was very damaging to those who were involved. What happened? Nothing happened. We are not EFCC. We are not ICPC. We are not government agency. Our role stop at advocacy is just like the media, just like what you were doing now, raising questions around the issue.
We will have to leave this conversation here now. I apologize, there's not much time that we have, but we have to leave it here. We must thank you, David Ugolor, former Director, Africa Network for Environment and Economic Justice, for your time on the program.
I am not former, I am still the Executive Director. I just came for the conference. I'll be back to Nigeria.
Executive Director, we apologize for that mix-up. Executive Director, Africa Network for Environment and Economic Justice. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.